Hi everyone, I'm back with a Stephen King review, which is something I never thought I would do on this channel. When I set up this channel over a year ago, my main aim, first and foremost, was to talk about the work of Richard Lehman. But then once I had reviewed every one of his novels, I decided to turn my attention to other horror novels which I love, or which I think are noteworthy, by lesser known writers. I never planned to do Stephen King just because anyone on the internet who has a horror related channel has discussed King. He's so famous, and I didn't really know what I can bring to the table that isn't already on the table, with the exception maybe of this novel, Bag of Bones, because Bag of Bones is a book that very rarely gets spoken about. Whenever you think of Stephen King and his work, I mean, this is certainly not a novel you immediately think of, almost never gets spoken about, and I have personal reasons for wanted to talk about it. Basically, I reread it the last week. I'm in a bit of a sentimental mood, and I wanted to reread something which marks a certain moment in my life. I'll share a bit of private information here. My wife yesterday gave birth to our first child, a daughter whose name is Anna. And knowing that that was going to happen, I've been in a very, like I said, sentimental mood. And this book has very powerful memories for me because I met Stephen King when this was published, and he signed it. He personally signed it to me. I almost said dedicated to me. Of course, he didn't do that, but there it is. To David, that's my real name. All the best, Stephen King, 7/11/00. That's the American format of dates, but it's the 11th of July, 2000 for my fellow Brits. And yeah, I met the guy. He came over here, not here, I'm in Russia now, but when I lived in the UK, Manchester, he came over to promote this book. He was very proud of it. He wanted to beat the drum for it. And it was so rare for him to do that because Stephen King suffered from a phobia of flying, which I want to plug a book here while I'm here on that subject. This collection of short stories here, Flight or Fright. It's 17 short stories of horror, all connected and set on aeroplanes, and it's edited by Stephen King. And there's a foreword in this where he talks about his phobia of flying and how he overcame it. But the reason I mention it is because when this was published in 1998, King was still petrified of flying, and for that reason he very rarely did book signings, book tours. And also because he just didn't need to. He was so famous at that point, anything he put out would go to #1. But he was so proud of this book that he really did want to promote it. So he came over to England, and I met the man. It was an amazing moment in my life. I mean, we didn't have an in-depth conversation or anything. It was a conveyor belt situation. You just went up to his desk with your book, said hello, thanked him in my case for his work. He feigned interest in what you were saying, and signed your book, and off you went. But it was still just a wonderful moment for me in my life because King is the most important writer to me in my life, and also, well, the most important artist of any kind to me. He's been a constant companion throughout my life. So yeah, this is a very treasured artifact that I own, this book, very important to me. As for the novel itself, well, it's not one of his greatest. It's not a bad book by any means. King has written a few what I consider to be bad novels, stuff like Dreamcatcher and Cell, and possibly From a Buick 8. But this isn't one of them. This is just a kind of forgettable, mediocre book. It's very derivative of his own work and also of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which I'll get to in a minute. This is a novel I will actually read. I was debating whether to read the synopsis because it's kind of pointless to do that. It doesn't give any sense of how convoluted this thing is. I'll read it anyway quickly. Here we go. Derry, Maine. This is set in Derry, like it. Mike Noonan's wife dies unexpectedly. After this tragic loss, the best-selling writer suffers acute writer's block, unable even to face the blank screen of the word processor without being shaken by nausea and panic. Then the nightmares and the voices start. Nightmares of Sarah Laughs, their beautiful lakeside retreat. Still, Mike is drawn inexorably to their once happy home, drawn to his old typewriter and the urge to write again. But the once familiar Western Maine town has changed. It's now in the tyrannical grip of millionaire Max DeVore and his terrifying skeletal bookkeeper. DeVore is determined to obtain custody of 3-year-old Kyra, his deceased son's child, and is twisting the community to his purpose. When the girl and her young mother turn to Mike for help, he finds himself powerless to resist them. but there are other more sinister forces at Sarah Last determined to stand in their way. That's the synopsis, and then there's a blurb here at the end. Bag of Bones is a gripping, distinctive, haunting tale of suspense, romance, terror, and grief, of lost love's enduring bonds, and of a new love struggling to be free of the past and the sins of the ancestors. Yeah, this book was very openly and consciously modelled on Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. It opens with a dead wife. There's a drowning involved. He goes to a house which is haunted by the ghosts and the memories of its former occupants. King was very open about that. There's no plagiarism going on. When he was promoting this book, he said that Rebecca is basically the blueprint for this book, just like Bram Stoker's Dracula was the blueprint for Salem's Lot. So it's really a marriage of The Shining and du Maurier's Rebecca. The Shining comes in because, again, you've got a haunted writer. So many of King's characters are writers. You've got Bill Denborough from It. You've got Thad Beaumont from The Dark Half. You've got the guy from Secret Window, Secret Garden. And this fella here, he's lost his wife. He's haunted. He goes off to an isolated location, also like The Shining, and he is haunted by the ghosts of that place, again, like The Shining. There is the Stephen King trope of the magical child, Kyra, who's telepathic in some way, again, like The Shining, Danny Torrance. King, I mean, like I said, the plot of this book is incredibly convoluted. It's like a bloody Mexican soap opera, this, because he keeps throwing out these connections and these new revelations which come out of nowhere and don't really seem to have any point. The whole idea of the K and the C connection, if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. Everyone who dies is connected with the letters K and C, and it ties into a former occupant who was murdered. And, well, I won't go into the details, but I don't know, it's just a bit... The plot feels a bit thrown together, and when that happens with somebody like King, I think Stephen King is the most naturally gifted storyteller of his generation. But now and again, he has something to say on a literary level, and when that happens, he seems to just cobble his plots together. In this case, he's pieced together a kind of a Frankenstein's monster of his own work. He's drawn from his past and then taken Rebecca. Because what he really wants to do in this book is he wants to talk about love. He wants to talk about all the different forms of love. This is a book about regeneration, about the death of various forms of love and the rebirth of it. Mike Noonan has just lost his wife. He's grief-stricken. But as the novel goes on, he falls in love again. His love of writing has gone. He's got writer's block. His love for his craft has disappeared. But that also, in some way, comes back. His appreciation for his craft, the love he feels for this little girl Kyra, reawakens in him that kind of emotion. It's a thematic novel. It's one of those books which is not really about telling a riveting story. That's why it's not endured. That's why no one thinks of this book anymore. It's why it's a forgotten novel, because the story just isn't there. What story is there was done so much better in The Shining, or in other of his kind of horror novels. I mean, there are moments in this book where it's almost like he remembered he was supposed to be a horror writer, so he just shoehorned in this really awkward horror element. It even says there in what I just read. This is why I decided in the end to read it, because that detail, it is now in the tyrannical grip of millionaire Max DeVore and his terrifying skeletal bookkeeper. I mean, yeah, of course she's skeletal because she's the baddie. She's the evil one. Why couldn't he just made her normal looking? But no, it's like he was writing this for him, meaningful, profound cri de coeur, this important book for what he wanted to say. But then he thought, wait a second, my fans expect horror. So let me just throw in this very stereotypical, hyper evil character who looks skeletal, and everything she says and does is cartoonishly evil. I think that this book kind of fails as a horror story because he didn't want to be writing a horror story. This novel ends with an epilogue, which in one way it's an epilogue to the novel, but it can also be read as Stephen King directly addressing the audience, his constant readers, as he calls us, his faithful fans. And one of the lines is, word for word, it says, "I have lost my taste for spooks." He's almost explaining why he wants to move on. He wants to stop being known as the horror guy and move on to writing other things that he wants to write, which is fine. Totally respect that. I love that he won, a few years after he published this, he would win the, I don't remember what it was called, but it was some very prestigious award in America that is usually given out to, literary titans, but they gave it to King, and it really annoyed the glitterati of the American intelligentsia. They were up in arms that this horror writer had been given this prestigious award. And I love that. I love when, supposedly hack writers like King, who write for lowly plebs like us, infringe upon the world of those self-appointed guardians and gatekeepers of great literature and high art, because he deserves it. I think that King, even in the 80s, when he was a out-and-out horror writer, books like The Stand and It contain great writing. I think I'm well read enough to credit my own opinion on this subject. I think that Stephen King is a great writer by any definition. And these people who criticized him when he won that award, they pointed to stuff like they would like cherry pick passages from his schlocky stuff, his fun throwaway chippings from the Master's Workbench stuff, like I don't know, Cycle of the Werewolf, or some of the kind of the overwrought passages in Christine, and they would say, how on earth can we possibly award this hack writer this award? To which I reply, go and read 11/22/63, one of the greatest masterpieces of literature of the last 100 years. Read some of the passages in It and The Stand, if you want to know why King is great. So anyway, the point I'm making, to come back, is that this came at an awkward period in King's career, when it was the beginning when he wanted to be taken, I think, more seriously as a writer. After this, he would publish The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, which is all right, but it's a kind of an obvious, slightly facile Christian allegory. Dreamcatcher would come then, terrible book. I mean, it starts brilliantly, but the last 200 pages is awful. He's not entirely to blame for that. He was doped out of his mind when he wrote it because of his car accident. From a Buick 8 would come after that, which isn't a good book. Cell has the worst ending of any novel he ever wrote. And then would come Lisa's Story in 2006, which is maybe the older brother of this book, because that's also concerned with the nature of lost love and recovered love, and, how a broken heart mends itself. So yeah, I mean, do I recommend this novel? No, not really. If you're a King fanatic and completist, you've probably read it already. But if you're new to King, why are you watching this channel if you're new to King? But if you are new to King, no, do not start here. It's such an awkward book. It is right on the cusp of the end of his golden era, which I think covers from the late 70s to about 1990. I think 4 Past Midnight, Needful Things was the end of his golden era of horror writing. And then he would go on this, era when he was trying to decide, well, what did he want to be after that? He'd already written all the spooks he wanted to write, as he says in the epilogue there, I'm done with spooks. He'd done all the horror stuff. He was wrapping up the Dark Tower series in 2003 and 4, and he would publish the last 3 Dark Tower books. He was concerned with that. But in terms of his standalone novels, this was not a good period for him at all. He would only get back on track with Under the Dome, in my opinion, in the late 2000s. So no, I don't recommend reading it if you are new to King, but like I said, it is an interesting piece of Stephen King history. It's a massive step up from what had immediately come before this. I mean, before this he wrote stuff like Rose Madder, which is just a failed experiment in every way. It doesn't work as a story, it doesn't work as a form. He plays around with the second person narrative, and it's awful book. But and then there was Insomnia, which is a kind of a Dark Tower crossover, which is dull, and similar to this, features a heartbroken husband who's just lost his wife. Yeah, not time for Stephen King's career. But thematically, even then, I'm not sure I recommend reading it, because he would perfect these ideas later on. I've already mentioned it, but 11/22/63, I think, is his literary masterpiece. It's not my favorite book of his, but it's certainly top 5. Favorite would be The Stand and It, but I think it's his greatest book. There's a case to be made that it's his best written novel. And that is a book also that deals with love in all of its forms, the heartbreak of a lost love, and what do you do once you've lost your reason for being. How do you go on? And King, being an optimistic writer, he always does find answers for that question, how to go on. Yeah, I think that this is a prototype for what would be done much better later on. So yeah, that's all I've got to say about it, really. It was nice to revisit it. I was transported back to my youth. But the main reason I love this book is because of its place in my own personal history of meeting the great man himself. So that's going to do it for this. Stephen King's Bag of Bones from 1998. Oh yeah, it was turned into an absolutely dreadful TV miniseries with Pierce Brosnan. Oh, it's awful. It's one of the worst adaptations of a King work I've ever seen. It's really terrible. In an already slightly dull novel, it somehow manages to strip away everything that was intriguing about it and reduce it to just 3 hours of absolute tedium. So yeah, I don't recommend that at all. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll be back soon with another King review, which I'll explain when I get to it. So bye for now.